All right, welcome back. We continue now with the next paper. Simeon Djankov will present it.
Thank you. So when, I'll come here maybe, when you invited me to this conference, he asked me to think of something and write something which is related to Ukraine. And then I thought, okay, I've not worked on Ukraine for about a decade or so. So I don't know much, but let me think of what may be interesting between Ukraine and my own country, Bulgaria, that one can write about. And one topic that has come up consistently in previous literature, academic literature, as well as a lot of, let's say, less academic studies, is that both Ukrainians and Bulgarians are fairly pessimistic people. So they don't look at life as the sun shining and the water is cool. They basically look at it as, you know, even if the sun is shining, it's about to rain. So, so I thought, well, maybe this is an interesting research area to do. Is it first the case that in our region more broadly, not just Bulgaria and Ukraine, but across our region, we tend to be more pessimistic than others? And if so, can I find the reason why? Because if I can find the reason why, then okay, at least we can explain it. Maybe there's some rationale to it. I will be using a lot of the same data and data set as the previous paper, that is DBRD's Life in Transition, but then we'll mix it with some other data, which is only focusing on this one question. Basically, are you happy with your life or not? And let's see whether we can first find whether Ukraine, Bulgaria, Russia, and a few other countries in this region are more pessimistic than they should be by common analysis. And can we think of other reasons why that may be the case? So let's see whether I can work this. So motivation. A few studies, I'll show you a couple that already have looked at this, both in a worldwide sense. There is a thing called the World Values Survey that doesn't cover all of our region, but covers some of the main countries like Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Serbia for some reason. And then basically finds that even if you take the world as a whole and do standard regressions on income, life expectancy, education, and so on, our countries, in this case particularly Ukraine, that's actually how I started with this, was on average the respondents, these are households, people, were much more pessimistic than their underlying indicators would suggest. And then there are a few other studies that focus on our region, Europe or Eastern Europe, that repeat this exercise in much more detail and basically find the same. There are different explanations why, but nobody in my mind so far tries to come up with a reasonable explanation. I'll show that I haven't come up with a reasonable explanation either, but we'll try later on in this paper. So I'll just show you two of the studies. The first study is a cross-country study, fairly detailed studies on economic growth, subjective well-being. I mentioned it already, the World Values Survey. Not all of the countries of transition are there, but basically they run simple regressions that say there are surveys of attitudes on how good you feel about yourself, and then all the variables that previous literature suggests. Income per capita, growth in the last few years, so maybe it's not a level, maybe it's a change effect. Education and change in education, although there the argument is not very clear because more educated people may be happier, maybe actually worse off, so not very clear, but anyhow. It was there. There are also a lot of comparatives, something that does not exist in many of the surveys that I would be using, basically saying, well, maybe they're unhappy because their peers look happier than they are. So there is some sort of comparison, with the neighbors, but that doesn't seem to be the case in our countries as well. And that study, as I mentioned, draws a very nice picture that basically shows Ukraine as the utmost pessimist country in the world relative to everybody else. So that's how I thought of doing this. Moldova was actually second most pessimistic, so away from the trend, and Bulgaria was third. And since the Bulgarians that I know, including some here, are very happy people, so it must be that it's not us, it's the others. So let's find out what it is. Yes, no. So, and there is another very interesting paper, more recent paper, by Sergei Guriev and Katya Zhuravskaya that uses the LITS, the 2006 LITS survey, finds this puzzle, goes around it to try and find out what it's due to, and basically doesn't. In the end, it says, well, there is a dummy of Eastern European unhappiness, if you like. We cannot explain it now with existing available data, but we pose it, and that's what I've written, that maybe it's a transitional effect. So maybe in another decade, they write in particular, once the next surveys are done, East Europeans would be happier because somehow they'll be part of Europe, they would have figured out that life is actually, I don't know, less tough than it looks, and so on. So this is what they conclude in their study. If you look over time, I'll show you some of these graphics actually. One interesting fact is that East Europeans relative to the rest of the world with time become less happy, not more happy. So somehow the deviation from trend is actually increasing over time, is not decreasing. So while this is not the point of our paper, just want to point out that this argument that maybe it was a short-term phenomenon, this extreme unhappiness, and then need to disappear over time, is not happening. Exactly the opposite is happening. So data sources. One of the benefits of this exercise, still at its early stages, is that previously people have used just one of available several sets of indicators. So typically either the World Values Survey, but as I mentioned, it doesn't have many countries in our region, or the LITS survey 2006, some 2010, 2014 is actually coming soon. European Values Survey, which is like the World Values Survey, but with more questions on Europe. But actually there are several other surveys, and we've mentioned two here. Eurobarometer, which is essentially done by the European Commission, or contracted by the European Commission. The benefit is that it's done every year. So actually, for a number of for all European countries and a few comparators, you have every year data on this question. So what we've done is that we have, is not a perfect match, I'll show you in a moment, but basically from 4 different surveys and from basically a 10 or 11 year horizon, we have put together all the questions that essentially go to this issue. Are you happy with your life? Are you satisfied with your life? Now, happiness and satisfaction, we discuss in the paper, not the same thing, but they go in the same direction, and where they do not, we try to run regression somewhat separately. So to show you the country sample, there are basically all of the countries in transition plus a number of other comparators. So we get to about 70 to 80 countries in any particular sample that we try, and about 10 years of data. So this is a panel data set. So here are some of the examples of questions. Life in transition, all things considered. Am I satisfied with my life now? Eurobarometer, on the whole, are you very satisfied, fairly satisfied, and so on. The Pew basically has a ladder of how you're happy with life or not. The European Values Survey is very simple. Taking all things together, how happy are you? And there is a 1 to 7 indicator. In the paper that most of you actually haven't seen, since it's still being written, including the including my discussant hasn't seen it yet. We discussed in detail basically what are the differences across these surveys. I will show you in a moment a correlation table. But in these surveys, if you standardize the satisfaction coefficients across countries, you still very clearly see this difference between, even in the raw data, between Central and East European countries, all the transition countries, and the rest, where the rest here are Western Europe, a lot of Latin America is in this survey, some of Asia, some of the rest of the middle income countries in the world. And then if you look at across countries, you saw in this particular case Bulgaria actually, without adjusting for other things, Bulgaria is the least satisfied country in the world, followed by Ukraine closely, then Russia, these are at the bottom. And then if you compare some of the West European countries, they are significantly above and a lot smoother over time. This smoothness may go towards the previous paper that was saying that maybe hits in fiscal, financial, or economic hits perhaps are still felt more significantly in Eastern Europe than in other parts of the developed world. This smoothness may go in that direction. Maybe I'll skip this, go to the correlation. So basically we have four sources of data: Pew, Life in Transition, Eurobarometer, European Values Survey. There is quite a lot of correlation among and across them, with the exception of the European Values Survey. Partly because, as I mentioned, they have this ladder of choices how satisfied you are with life, and in the middle, in the data, there seems to be nothing. So you're either very happy or very unhappy. It's a very binary variable. So from this, in a variety of ways, we construct basically a standardized satisfaction score that in some sense is a composite of these previous ones. And then, as I'll show you in a moment, start running the basic regressions that previous studies in the literature have done. First, let me show you with the standardized satisfaction. So we've tried here to show the Ukrainian flag, but somehow our yellow is not that yellow. But basically, the yellowish is Central and East European countries. We have the trend line in satisfaction, GDP per capita locked, and then the non-CE countries. So you already here can see a lot of outliers, basically, in the sense of what I mentioned. Very consistent with previous literature. So this graph exists in several, at least a dozen previous papers from different other surveys. And then I've showed you some, if you go survey by survey, which are these outliers. Actually, the bottom one is again Bulgaria. It's not listed here, but you see Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Moldova is at the bottom as well. So consistent across surveys. This is the panel of 11 years, and since I promised to do a lot on Ukraine, so you can see a lot of Ukraine here. First improving over time, and then actually starting to go down again over time, maybe consistent with the previous paper that we mentioned. So my regressions are going to be very short. I already told you the punchline. What I'm trying to do is first see, is there a Central and East European dummy, which is actually the whole transition period? And if so, can I kill it with something, roughly speaking? It's a very basic empirical strategy at this stage. But this is roughly what we do. So we always include income per capita, which consistently works. So richer countries are happier. Not a big surprise, the previous literature shows it, but in whatever basic regressions we do, there is a very significant negative, very highly significant East European dummy. So East Europeans relative to the rest of the world at that level of per capita income are less happy. And here, let's first actually start from column 4, which is that we start, or maybe, sorry, column 3 first. So, well, so you're rich, makes sense, so you'll be happier. If you live longer, you're happier, actually you don't seem to be happy if you live longer. And we've tried several things, not just on life expectancy, but basically different diseases that are prevalent or not prevalent in these countries, what percentage of the population is sick by these diseases at what periods of time, and so on. Somehow, at least in this panel, things related to health are not significant, or at least not consistently significant. Then we thought to go and try some so-called cultural or historical variables. So one that I like is, again, thinking about Ukraine, Bulgaria, is Orthodox religion. So unlike Catholic religion, where basically you can sin a lot and then you go and say, please pardon me, they pardon you and you can sin again. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, basically that's it. If you sin, you burn forever. So we thought, well, maybe we put a dummy for Orthodox. There's some Orthodox, some not Orthodox, and actually it turns out to be quite significant over time. The previous literature has not used this precise dummy, so this is a small contribution. What we have also used is not presented here for brevities. We have used variables constructed by Katya Zhuravskaya and others on historical variables on which empire you belong to for how long. Russian Empire, Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on. That also is fairly significant, not as significant as this simple Orthodox variable versus Catholic and so on, but is also significant. So history or culture, if you like, certainly play a role. But you notice they actually don't kill the dummy variable, and this is ultimately what I would like to do. So what to cut the story short, going through this process, we started thinking, well, maybe it's something that in these countries, people don't just think of their well-being unrelated to the well-being of the country, but somehow they relate how the country is doing or their perception of how the country is doing with their own well-being. So we put here as a start, understanding that this is highly correlated and you cannot prove any causality or don't want to, a corruption variable. And suddenly you can see first on the second column and then on the last column, the corruption variable actually kills the CEE effect. At least so far, nobody else has tried this. It's not a big improvement. I'll tell you why in a moment. Basically because it's also an attitudinal variable. But you start thinking, okay, so basic variables don't explain it. I'm almost finished. Basic variables don't explain it. Some of them are significant in the way that you would expect them. But corruption seems to be quite significant. So what is behind corruption? This is the question for the discussant to tell us. But one direction in which we are going and constructing variables proves to be very complicated. Let me try to see, is this. And this is another graph that consistently has come up in previous literature, but nobody yet has gone further to try and get variables that are significant enough to put in regressions. So this is from one of the Pew survey, but actually there are two of the other three surveys have similar questions and the results are remarkably similar. So what is it? If you ask in Eastern Europe first, are you satisfied with your life, which is the blue, you give certain percentage, so 35% are satisfied. If you ask the same question on your country, so seemingly unrelated to you, are you satisfied with the way Bulgaria is going or Ukraine is going? Roughly the same percentage says, yes, we are satisfied. And actually the non-satisfied are consistent as well. But if you ask the same question in Western Europe, you get remarkably different answers. So in other words, in Western Europe, when you answer, are you happy? You think of yourselves, it seems, or your family and say, this is what it is. And when you ask about the country, you somehow separate the two, differentiate the two. While in Central and Eastern Europe, that differentiation is not there. And this is consistent across time and across surveys. In the rest of the sample, which is mostly Latin America, as I mentioned, South Asia, the differentiation, as in Western Europe, is not so striking, but still, it's significantly more than Eastern Europe. Where I hope this would lead us somehow to the discussion that even though we are 25 years into the transition from central planning and communism to democracy and market economy, somehow, unlike in the rest of the world, in the minds of our people, us, in addition to some other variables that I've shown you, somehow we still regard our life as very linked to, I don't know how to say it, the government, the state. So the way that the state has behaved in terms of corruption, in terms of its perceived success, continues to affect our attitudes towards our own success, which again is not what we see in Western Europe. So in the remaining of the paper, when we do manage to finish it, we're going to go, and we have started this process, and explore variables that can get us into this direction, and hopefully go beyond the corruption variable and say, we understand it's not corruption, it's their attitude towards how they see the government or the state performing for them, or maybe for their part of the population or not, and try to disentangle this dummy variable. And I think these are the preliminary conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you, Simeon. The discussant is Andrew Clark, who has not seen the paper.
Okay, so you know, sometimes when you discuss a paper and you're in another country, you have what we call a problem of translation. Okay, so here is one of these problems of translation. Usually the idea to be a discussant is you discuss a paper. Now, first issue here is there isn't a paper. Second problem is that these results have just changed hugely from the PowerPoint I was sent 5 days ago. So, yeah, progress is being made as we speak. So, anyway, moving swiftly on, this is what I think the paper might say when it's written, okay? I'm English, I'm a perfect match for this paper. In England, it's not a question of it's sunny, but soon it's going to rain. It's rather, it is raining, and it always has been. So I'm good at pessimism. We do that. That's one of the things we export. So let me move on to what I think my main comments on this paper are. What I think Simeon's trying to say is you're in trouble, okay? And you're in trouble for more than one reason, okay? Not only, as we heard last night, is Eastern Europe not that good at taking resources and turning it into GDP, it's also really not very good at taking GDP and turning it into happiness. So you've got this kind of Eastern European double whammy that is making Eastern Europe less happy than it should be given its income, and certainly than it should be given the resources that it started off with. So let me tell you what I think we can do about this and what I think the answers might be to the version of the paper that I saw 3 days ago. Okay, so I'm really into recycling, and as you notice, I've actually recycled their presentation as well. So Eastern Europe isn't doing as well as its income would predict. And I first thought, when I first saw the title of this, I opened the PowerPoint, I thought, oh great, this is a paper that's going to show adaptation to free markets, adaptation to democracy and so on. But I don't think it can really be that. That can't be the answer for the gap between Eastern and Western Europe. Because if it's just a question of adaptation, then we should be at the same level. Because surely the West has adapted as well. So it can't just be this, oh, that was good for a little time, but now we're going to go back to where we were, kind of argument. So I'm going to kick that one out as a potential explanation. This is what we're trying to understand, the gap between East and West. And actually, one thing that Simeon didn't really insist upon, though he did mention it in terms of other work, is this gap is pretty damn stable, actually. even there might be some suggestion, though I couldn't quite do it in my head, that the East is sort of catching up, though maybe this is just a load of noise around the estimates. But it's certainly, here's good news for you, it's not getting worse, right? It's like bad, but it's not getting any worse. So, you know, that's kind of good news, isn't it, right? Okay, so the East is not falling further behind, if you like. Okay, here is the Ukrainian flag again. This is the kind of inefficiency in transforming income into happiness. Given the amount of income you've got here, the levels of happiness in Eastern Europe are lower than you would have predicted. Okay, so something's going wrong in this transformation if you want to think about it that way. What could this be? So dollars buy less happiness in Eastern Europe than they do in Western Europe, and that seems kind of weird. Okay, so what could be going on? One thing that could be going on here is this is just a really naff measure of income. Right? GDP per capita is not what we're interested in. That's not fundamentally what interests me. It's not what interests you either. What interests you is the level of resources you have available for your family. And that's what we call equivalent income, household income, or better, equivalent income. And you could tell a story about household sizes across East and Western Europe that could maybe just even this out. And that would be something I think you should try. What is the post-Soviet legacy? Of course, I don't know. One thing that you might have brought across from olden times is low expectations. And I'm English, so I know what I'm talking about here, right? We don't expect anything, and that's what we get as well. So I'm thinking football here, but you get the general idea. So the post-Soviet legacy is low expectations. You don't expect things to work that well. And that may well be true, but of course it goes in the other direction. The lower your expectations, the happier you are with whatever you get. So this is not a good candidate for explaining an Eastern European happiness gap. Okay, a second legacy is that of social capital. And I was very impressed by a paper on volunteering in East and West Germany. I believe it was an Alois Stutzer paper. Maybe the transition came with some kind of movements in social capital that were involved with the movement from one regime to another. And in the Stutzer paper, it's the loss of volunteering capacity that came with the fall of the Berlin Wall. But from what I've heard over the past day, everyone is telling me civil society is on the rise rather than disappearing. So this doesn't seem like it's a good candidate as well, though I'm actually going to come back to this at some point if I've got time. This is a kind of cheap shot, but hey, I'm the discussant, so I can do this, right? The gap is constant. Is this a language effect? So you'd like to look at, you know, take a random Bulgarian who moved abroad, Simeon, and, you know, just... You know what I'm going to get at here. Just look at the use of language effect and see if you can pick out something there. Okay, there could be other potential omitted variables, and we've looked at the effect of corruption, we've looked at the effect of life expectancy, which does nothing at all. We've done quite a lot of work on the variance of happiness using the WVS, the EVS, that's the World and European Values Survey. The two most important variables we got are not life expectancy, because that just doesn't work. I don't think people know it, actually. I don't think people know what that is. The under 5 mortality rate really works well. So that might be a health variable you'd like to look at. And the second one we found, apart from income itself, that makes a big difference across countries over time, is something called limits on civil liberties, which is an independent evaluation from Freedom House that does exactly what you think it might do. So those might be worth looking at. Now, this is a classic discussants comment. The classic discussants comment is, oh, what an interesting paper. Now, here's how I would have done it. So this is what I'm going to do here. So fantastic work, but throw all of that away and do this instead. I would have done individual level regressions. My satisfaction on my income, equivalent income, and then my demographics and wave times country dummies. And that just gives you lots more variation in terms of income, of course. And one one thing that's kind of underlying the discussion in this paper is that income doesn't work so well in Eastern Europe, but there's no formal test of it. And if you do this, then you can do a formal test of this. You can look explicitly on the coefficient on income in a happiness regression, separating Eastern and Western Europe, and just see whether one is different from the other, or you pool and you interact, this kind of thing. Or something that I would really like to do is even run a latent class analysis, which is a fancy way of saying let the data sort out itself, which points are in which regressions. Yeah, I'm almost done. Do that in the 1990s data, do that in the 2000s data separately, and then see whether some countries switch from being Eastern to being Western. Instead of predefining that yourself, let the data see which countries look more like each other. Okay, I said I'd come back to social capital. The post-Soviet legacy, whatever that is much more germane, it's much more salient for people who are born at certain times than others. And again, taking this individual level data, maybe you could split into those who were born pre-1980, say, who grew up under a certain regime, those who were born after 1980, or maybe, I don't know, you can choose the year yourselves. And then compare those two to the same two age groups in a different country that started off with the same level of income. So it would be a sort of difference in difference, if you like. Okay, and then one of the reasons I thought about this was, again, the rise in civil society, but a lot of people yesterday were insisting this is a young person's movement. It's a young people's thing, in which case maybe the older group are being somehow left behind, and you might want to look at that as well. Okay, let me finish with 3 slides. This is the picture that Simeon showed us. This is what we call weird. That's a technical term. What is going on here? In Eastern Europe, individuals are satisfied with their country, but not satisfied with how well they themselves are doing. We all know these surveys of, are you above median intelligence? And about 90–95% of people think they're above median intelligence. And, of course, that can't be right. But is there some misperception in Eastern Europe? Do people think they're worse off than they actually are? And we could get a grip on this. First from last thought. Is happiness more than life satisfaction? This sounds like a very strange thing to say, right? But what I mean here is that life satisfaction may only be part of the overall well-being index that we would use as an input into a social welfare function. So life satisfaction is important, but other things might matter as well, like positive and negative effects, as Danny Kahneman and Angus Deaton and Alan Kruger have insisted, or perhaps much more importantly here especially, eudaimonia, measures of self-sufficiency, of relationships, of meaning and purpose in life, as Ed Deasy and Carol Riff have put forward in psychology. Now, you may say to me, Simeon may say to me, well, that's very interesting, I haven't got the data, but you know what you have, because they're in the European Social Survey Waves 3 and 6, and Ukraine has appeared in the European Social Survey since Wave 2. So you can just download those for free from the ESS site. My last thought is, and this is a tiny little bit heretical, is this really East versus West? Or is this rich versus poor? We don't know, because we're only looking at East versus West. So the placebo test I'd like to see here would be to redo all of this analysis with rich Western countries versus not so rich Western countries. And then just see if you're getting the same kind of results coming out, in which case you're talking about stages of economic development and there is no legacy as such identified. That's it. Thanks very much.
Simeon, would you like to take a few minutes to respond?
Thank you. So for the young researchers among you, I think what we demonstrated for you here is very valuable. So if you can get a good idea, then develop it a little bit, then get invited to a conference, ask for a very smart discussant, let him or her develop the paper and how it should be, and then just write it and thank him in the footnote. You have a nice paper. So
the arrangement was co-authorship.
So that's what we demonstrated intentionally in this panel. Indeed, since as you can see, this is early stages, and we really started with a brand new paper for this conference, so we have to do a lot more work. And having the discussants' notes will be our to-do list. Just quickly to mention two things that I forgot. One of the basic motivations actually for this paper, and one interesting variable. So one other variable that people have used traditionally in studies of happiness is sunlight, on the idea that, if you're always in the sun and, hopefully you have a beach, you should be happy. So we actually have tried the sunlight variable here, days of sunlight in a year, something like that. And it not only is not significant, but sometimes it enters with the opposite effect. That is that in countries that are further south, Bulgaria is a good example, somehow notwithstanding the sunny weather, people are still pessimistic. So just for to comment on that. But I forgot to mention, perhaps, other than the interesting factual here and trying to resolve this puzzle, for me, what was the main reason in going this direction and trying to understand happiness, life satisfaction, and so on, which is that there is a separate literature, which I would like to see develop more, that basically links attitudes of people to the likelihood and then success of economic reform, so actually any reform, social reform, economic reform. And not surprisingly, that literature finds that if people are fairly pessimistic to begin with, anything new that you propose basically is met a priori with, let's say, neglect, maybe a nice word to put it, but basically doubt. And as a result, that in this kind of more pessimistic countries, reforms are less likely to happen. And as a result, economic growth or social development is retarded. Now, just finish with one sort of example from my own political career. Many of you know that I was for a while in the Bulgarian government, and when I was entering the government, the Prime Minister-elect basically invited me to his home, said, "You're going to be the next finance minister." I told him I need to tell my family, so don't tell anybody for 2 days. He said, "Absolutely, you can depend on me." I got onto the taxi from his house to the downtown, and on the radio we listened to the Prime Minister has just announced the first minister in his government. And then the taxi driver, who doesn't know me, I was relatively unknown in Bulgaria at the time, says, "Oh, this guy is as corrupt as the previous ones. He's never going to do anything." So the point is, and if you have this attitude, okay, should I be here? Should I be doing reform? So it really affects how you do institutional change.
Thanks so much. Questions? Oleg.
I will pretend this is a question. Are we on? Is this on? Or is
Yes,
there...
yeah. Top.
Yes. My attitude towards making comments or from the floor is to be like Antony and Shakespeare. I have come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The praise goes without saying, but expectations of what Simeon would do have been fully fulfilled. Thank you, Simeon, for an excellent presentation and a likely fantastic paper, especially after you take into account various comments. The main comment I have, not to take up too much time, is I was a little surprised, maybe time was the explanation, a little surprised that you didn't give more focus to the differences within the CEE. I mean, there has been, and Andrew Clark hinted at this, there has been a huge difference in performance between a more successful, let's call them, and the less successful cases, and let's take, Poland and Ukraine, very big differences. Has that changed things? Your broad fit, or your broad scatter doesn't seem to show that, but that surprises me. In Poland, I would expect to have seen some increase in satisfaction, at least for a time, but then again, they may have raised their expectations. You know, first we want to reach the close to the average of the EU, and then we want to go above the average, and so on. And here, I think you might give in the model presentation a little bit more emphasis to the expectations question. I mean, in Ukraine, it's not surprising that people would be extremely unhappy. You give a suggestion about fatigue with lack of transformation. I think a better word is frustration. While the per capita income, I mean, I don't believe for a moment these suggestions that Ukraine's per capita GDP is only 80% of what it used to be in 1990. Anybody who writes that hasn't walked on the streets of Ukraine. But everybody knows that Poland's income, which used to be equivalent to Ukraine's, is 3 times higher. That must have a tremendous influence on expectations and frustration and satisfaction.
You know, my priors were exactly as yours, so I've followed Ukraine and Bulgaria, so I would have sort of gotten a story for both countries. But then when I looked across countries that I think I know well, which is Central and Eastern Europe, I was surprised by what's happening in the data over time. Actually, the country that is improving most in its, let's say, attitudes towards life is Hungary. But actually, in the last decade, Hungary has been the country with least economic progress among Central and Eastern European countries. And Poland actually started improving in the very early data in the late 90s, and then actually stabilized and even started going down, maybe because of what you say, expectations were increased very substantially, and then you're not meeting the new expectations, but something is going on that is different from our priors, which is nice in research, so that you have a puzzle. So it's not the case that the most successful in terms of growth or other measures of development countries, Estonia, Poland, are doing the best. It's actually countries that a priori you would not think are doing that great, but for some other reason are doing better than expected. So clearly a lot of extra work to do. Maybe it's this frustration in some countries that you mentioned, and the unmet but changing expectations in other countries. And perhaps we can differentiate between these two.
Thank you very much. My name is Pierre Jacquet from the Global Development Network. I was a bit surprised that there was not more discussion about this link between income and happiness. And to be more precise, I think I missed a discussion about the role of expectations. It came a little bit in the discussion. And a psychologist, and I have in mind this book, Stumbling on Happiness by Dan Gilbert, which I think is a great book to try to understand what happiness is about, makes a correlation between the level of expectations and unhappiness. So the more you expect, the more it means that you are not still there, that you are frustrated. There are wants that have not been met, and the higher the risk that you will be disappointed, basically. And in a way, that could explain the situation between the West and the East. In the West, you have high income, you have some disappointment with governments, and it means that you have lesser expectations, and therefore you may be happier. In the East, I would disagree with what was said. I think there are tremendous expectations. I mean, of course, I disagree without having the right to disagree, because I'm not from the region. So you are the ones to know. But I was a bit surprised. I would expect the region to be in a position of very high expectations about the future. At least it's a wonderful opportunity to change, and therefore there is a hope that the income will improve. And that might make you very unhappy, actually, because the pace of improvement is disappointing. So I was a bit surprised that there was not more on expectations, the whole expectation, and this sort of bizarre relationship between expectation and unhappiness.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to challenge one of your readings, the Guria-Turovskaya paper. I read it very differently from you. So I think that they explain much of the variance. So they look at 4 factors. They look at income, they look at the level of public services, and they look at 2 shocks. One, the shock to income, and the shock to human capital. And once they've done that, the only country that they cannot explain, I think, is Hungary. But so again, I may remember that paper incorrectly. We did something very superficial, looking at the comparison of LIT's Life in Transition survey in 2006 and 2010, and looking at the impact of sort of shocks to income. And one thing that stood out was that those that had a very deep transitional shock in the early 90s, they had a much less impact of the global crisis in 2008. So there's something like a resilience effect coming out. And the other thing was, of course, that there was a very strong correlation between the size of the shock that the country had been hit and the impact of the crisis. But so I think those are sort of some variables you may want to look at.
Quickly on the 2 points. Expectations, no, I think you're very right. So we need to look more and understand what were the priors of people at the beginning or early in the transition period. The beginning we don't have data, but relatively early we do. And how these priors affect later on what changes basically their perceptions. And we are trying, in fact, to construct such variables. Most of the surveys don't have them, but some do. So one of the further work that we are doing is exactly in that regard. And the preliminary evidence does suggest the type of effects that you mentioned are likely to appear. So expectations do matter, but again, they do not remove completely this Central East European variable. And to Eric, no, you're right about the Sergei and Katya's paper. They do explain a lot. But again, in the end, the variable, at least in my mind, remains. It's a lot weaker than it was at the beginning, so a lot was already explained, especially with the shocks, but there is still something that significantly remains. And they just pose it. I think I would have posed it exactly the same thing at the time, that maybe over time that would disappear as well as these countries become more normal, so to speak. But if you just look between the 2006 LITs and 2010 that they don't use in their survey, actually, at least in the raw data, the spread maybe doesn't grow, but at least doesn't get smaller. So that's what I'm taking from it, that it's something else. In addition to shocks, maybe the expectations, maybe some of the things that Andrew said that we have not captured so far, that we need to capture in the next round of work, and hopefully the next LITs also help us in this regard.
David.
Thank you, David Snellbecker. So if I understand your methodology correctly, you're essentially looking at GDP per capita as a proxy for average family's income. But if I recall the data, that's not necessarily a good proxy across these countries, because in countries like Ukraine, just to guess at the numbers, average wages might be maybe 30% of GDP, whereas in Western Europe, average wages might be the wage base might be something like 60% of GDP. And so if you were to look at average wages, and if you can, best would be net wages as your variable, then you might find that all of those East European countries might shift up in your scatter plot, and the effect that you're looking at possibly would go away. Possibly this is also related to the corruption factor, because I don't really know why wages as a share of GDP is very small in Ukraine and these countries. Corruption could be one sense of it. When you look at the national accounts data, there seems to be a lot of income that just evaporates, and it's hard to figure out where it goes.
Very good point. So we have actually tried not net wages. Maybe you're right. We should try a cleaner measure. We have tried average wages, and it significantly improves the fit, so to speak, relative to what we've shown you. but does not remove the significance and even the magnitude of the CE dummy. So it improves the understanding of maybe the income mechanism. Yes, it is stronger if you get a clean variable. So perhaps in the basic regression, we should go in the direction that you suggest for the reason that you mentioned.
I have a question to Simeon regarding that religion dummy. You said it was significant. I would like to ask if you have considered to evaluate the effect of cultural values in more general terms, like I hope to pronounce it correctly, from Inglehart-Welzel cultural map where these culture patterns are plotted from all over the globe, and there are some clear fragmentation, like Orthodox culture, Protestant Europe, Catholic Europe, Islam, and so on. Have you considered to use such data? And second, my question regarding the previous question is when you consider some income level, do you in any way evaluate effect of so-called shadow economy? For example, for Ukraine, it's evaluated to the different estimations from 30 to up to 70% of shadow economy, meaning it's not something criminal, but it's not economy where the government knows it's there. Thank you.
Thank you. So in some sense, the second question is similar to the previous question. If we had a better variable of net wages, then in some sense we are taking away to a large extent the effect on the shadow economy. And the answer is we don't have net wages. We've tried gross wages, let's say. The results improve in terms of fit. We will try net wages, and when we do, if we can get this data consistently, I think we can, then in some sense the issue of what exactly are we capturing with the income variable to a large extent should go away. The cultural variables, how to put it? Generally, in my research, I haven't been in favor of complicated variables. So that's because then I'm not sure exactly what I'm explaining. So that's why I can sort of understand what's Eastern Orthodox versus Catholic versus Protestant and so on. And that we use in some different specifications, some simple as I showed you, as well as percentage of different religions, including over time if there is breakup of countries and so on. And as I showed you, this is very, very significant variable. The other variable that I would like to use in that direction, and we have constructed, as I mentioned, is did you belong to any empire and for how long? On the argument that through the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bulgaria was very affected, for example, by being 500 years under the Ottomans. It certainly brings a lot of culture, or in our case, lack of culture. And we are trying to do that. The variable already is constructed, and I think we'll get a lot of play from it. From there on, what other culture variables that are not very related to religion you can get at? I welcome the audience for some others, but I would like simple variables so we don't get into this complicated explanations.
Thanks to Simeon and for the presentation. Just a couple of random thoughts on what we've just heard. First, I think it would be good to have to explore a little bit, because you have this quite long panel data set. So to, as Oleg was suggesting earlier, to separate and see if, to use a little bit more of the heterogeneity in terms of the CE countries have amongst themselves, because you have Poland, you have the Czech Republic, and my prior would be that probably there would be some change over time over these past 25 years. So perhaps it would be good not to bundle it and try to explore a little bit more. Something that struck me in the last slide, where people, where you compare Eastern and Western Europeans and the attitudes toward life and satisfaction with life, and where you have almost the same level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction in Eastern Europe, both at the personal level and with what I interpret to be the government, where the country is going, I think was the variable. I would interpret it, okay, probably people are unhappy because they're frustrated with the inability of the government to reform, in our case, for instance, to institute better judiciary, to better protect private property, and corruption was mentioned. So perhaps I think you have to dig in a little bit more in that regard, because then you were saying, oh, Western Europeans, on the other hand, are happy with their lives, and in a sense, this is, you may say, well, the richer they are, but then maybe the fact that they are unhappy with their government is, for me, is not so telling. And I was even wondering, because the date was 2014 on that, whether this is somehow isolated to recent crises or the events in the Eurozone and the frustration of people with the inability of the Western governments as a whole to make things better. And finally, for instance, I was wondering if Greece, Portugal, countries like Spain perhaps too, that have lately experienced economic decline and economic problems, could be in a way also affecting this. I assume the weights are the same in this data, but maybe you could also, as a side experiment, to compare similar geographically locations like Bulgaria and Greece, where incomes are different, but I'm wondering, what the effect of the crisis has been on overall satisfaction of people with their own lives and also with the country, where the country is going. So thank you.
I also would like to take the paper in that direction to understand whether somehow in our region still people over-depend, if you like, link their lives too much to what at the macro level the government does or does not do, and as a result, regardless of their own indicators, they somehow still think, maybe rightly so, maybe not rightly so, that their expectations towards the government has to be somehow validated, and then they are happy. Because you're right, I've looked at the Greek survey, and it exactly meets my prior. So basically, people say the government sucks, but we're extremely happy at the personal level. So this is roughly what the 2014 survey says. So it either means that they're not so dependent on the government, or that they don't pay any taxes. So as a result, regardless of the government, they're quite happy. But clearly, a lot of work on this topic.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thanks very much, Simeon. Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks, audience.